Welcome, travelers of the night, to another chilling descent into the scary hours of darkness. I'm your host, Midnight Rider. There's a primal, inescapable fear that awakens when the world is suddenly erased by a thick, suffocating fog. When the ancient coastal forests go dead silent, and the heavy, rolling mist brings with it an unnatural cold and the foul stench of decay. Tonight, we journey to the rugged, misty shores of the Pacific Northwest, where towering redwoods and rocky cliffs harbor ancient, unspeakable things that watch from the gray void. Things that mimic our loved ones, things that hunt. Before we step off the trail and into the shadows, please make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below to help keep the darkness at bay. Now, let's get into tonight's stories. Story 1, submitted by Jason Marlowe. This story happened to me on October 14th, 2015. My name is Jason Marlowe, and at the time, I was 26 years old. My best friend Ryan and I had been planning a trip to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State for the better part of 6 months. We were both avid backpackers, the kind of guys who scoffed at established campgrounds and preferred to hike out into the backcountry where the only sounds were the wind and our own breathing. We had conquered quite a few trails together, but the coastal wilderness of the Pacific Northwest was a completely different beast. Our plan was to hike the rugged coastline near Rialto Beach, pushing past the famous hole-in-the-wall rock formation and trekking several miles up the coast to a secluded cove we had mapped out. The allure of the Olympic coast is its wild, untamed nature. The forest doesn't just stop politely at a sandy beach. It violently crashes into the ocean. Massive, ancient Sitka spruce and hemlock trees cling precariously to crumbling sea cliffs, and the beaches are littered with giant, bleached driftwood logs that look like the bones of prehistoric leviathans, tossed aside by the furious winter storms. We arrived at the trailhead early in the afternoon. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies and mild autumn temperatures, which, for the Washington coast in October, was a rare and beautiful gift. The air smelled sharply of brine, decaying kelp, and the deep earthy scent of wet pine needles. We hoisted our heavy packs onto our shoulders, double-checked our tide charts, and began the hike. The tide is the most critical element of coastal backpacking. You have to time your movements perfectly. If you get caught on a narrow stretch of beach during high tide, the ocean will literally crush you against the sheer rock cliffs or pull you out into the freezing, churning surf. We knew this. We were prepared for this, or at least we thought we were. The first few miles were breathtaking. The sun was shining, casting brilliant, blinding reflections off the rolling waves. We navigated over the massive piles of driftwood, our boots finding purchase on the slick, sea-polished stones. Ryan was in high spirits, snapping photos of the sea stack's towering pillars of rock jutting out of the ocean, crowned with a few stubborn, wind-battered trees. It wasn't until around 4:30 in the afternoon that things began to change. I remember stopping to take a drink from my canteen when I noticed the horizon. The sharp line where the blue ocean met the sky had completely vanished. In its place was a thick, bruised-looking wall of gray mist. It wasn't rolling in like normal fog. It was moving with a strange, deliberate speed, swallowing the sea stacks one by one as it advanced toward the shore. "Hey Ryan," I called out, pointing toward the water. "Looks like the weather forecast was dead wrong. Marine layer is moving in fast." Ryan stopped, shielding his eyes as he looked out. The temperature dropped significantly in a matter of minutes. The warm autumn air was instantly replaced by a biting, damp cold that seeped right through my flannel shirt. "Yeah," he muttered, frowning. "We should probably pick up the pace. We still have about a mile and a half until we reach the campsite, and the tide is starting to come in." We adjusted our packs and started moving faster. The beach was narrowing. The ocean, which had seemed so calm and distant an hour ago, was now creeping closer, the waves crashing louder and with more ferocity. And then, the fog hit us. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just a mist, it was a physical barrier. It was so dense that within seconds, visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. The world around us was instantly erased. replaced by a suffocating, blinding white void. The sound of the ocean was muffled, distorted, making it impossible to tell exactly how close the waves were getting. "Jason, keep close!" Ryan yelled over the roar of the surf. His voice sounded flat, swallowed instantly by the heavy, moisture-laden air. Panic started to bubble up in my chest. We were walking blind on a beach that was rapidly shrinking. Every few minutes, a wave would crash harder than the last, sending freezing, salty foam washing over the toes of our boots. I pulled out my compass and the map, but in the featureless gray void, they were virtually useless. We had to keep the ocean on our left and the cliffs on our right, but the strip of land between them was disappearing. "We can't keep going," I shouted, stopping in my tracks. "The tide is coming in faster than the chart said, or the storm surge is pushing it higher. If we hit a choke point up ahead, we're gonna get swept out." Ryan materialized from the fog, his face pale and beaded with condensation. He looked at the churning, violent gray water, then up at the sheer, dark silhouette of the tree-lined cliff to our right. "We have to get off the beach," Ryan said, his voice tight with anxiety. "There's a ravine right here. It looks like a rough scramble, but it cuts up into the forest. We can camp up there for the night, wait out the high tide and the fog, and figure it out in the morning." I didn't like the idea of bushwhacking into the dense, uncharted coastal forest, but the ocean left us no choice. A massive wave crashed against a nearby log, sending a spray of icy water entirely over us. That made the decision for us. We turned away from the ocean and began to climb. The ravine was steep, choked with thorny salmonberry bushes, slick mud, and the rotting trunks of fallen trees. We slipped and slid, our heavy packs pulling us backward as we desperately scrambled up the embankment. The fog was just as thick in the trees, but it took on a darker, more sinister hue. The canopy above blocked out whatever little daylight was left, casting the forest into a premature, oppressive twilight. After about 20 minutes of exhausting, terrifying climbing, we reached a small, relatively flat plateau, nestled deep within the massive trees. The roar of the ocean was muffled down to a steady, rhythmic thrumming, blocked by the earth and the dense foliage. We were soaked to the bone, freezing and exhausted. We immediately set to work pitching our tent. We didn't bother with a fire. Everything was too wet. And honestly, the sheer exhaustion had drained us of the energy required to forage for dry kindling. We just wanted to get into our sleeping bags and get warm. By the time we zipped the tent shut, it was completely dark outside, the kind of darkness that presses against your eyes. We ate some cold protein bars in silence, the adrenaline fading and leaving behind a deep, aching soreness in our muscles. "At least we didn't drown," Ryan joked weakly, shining his headlamp up at the ceiling of the tent. "Yeah," I replied, shivering as I pulled the sleeping bag up to my chin. "Tomorrow morning, the tide will be out, the fog will hopefully burn off, and we can get back on the beach. Let's just get some sleep." We clicked off our headlamps. The darkness was absolute. For the first few hours, I slept out of sheer exhaustion. But around 1 or 2 in the morning, I don't know the exact time because I was too terrified to check my watch, I woke up. I didn't wake up slowly. I snapped awake, my eyes wide open in the pitch black, my heart hammering against my ribs. The air in the tent was freezing, but I was sweating. Something was wrong. The primal, lizard part of my brain was screaming at me that I was in danger. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. The sound of the ocean was a distant, dull roar. The wind was whispering through the high branches of the spruce trees. And then I heard it. Crunch, snap, thud. It was the sound of a heavy footstep. It wasn't the light, skittering sound of a raccoon or even the measured, four-legged padding of a bear or a cougar. It was a massive, deliberate, bipedal stride. Crunch, snap, thud. The vibrations traveled through the damp earth and straight into the floor of the tent, right into my spine. Whatever was out there was heavy, incredibly heavy. It was walking slowly, methodically, just outside the perimeter of our small campsite. I held my breath, terrified that the sound of my own exhalations would give away my position. Beside me, I felt Ryan shift. He inhaled sharply, a hitch in his breath that told me he was awake, and he was hearing it too. "Jason," he breathed, his voice barely a microscopic whisper. "Do you hear that?" "Yes," I whispered back, my vocal cords tight with terror. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." The footsteps continued. They were circling the tent. The agonizing slowness of the creature's pacing was what terrified me the most. It wasn't just walking past, it was investigating us. It knew we were here. Crunch. Thud. Pause. The footsteps stopped right outside the thin nylon wall of the tent, directly next to where my head was lying. I could hear the wet, spongy moss compressing under an immense weight. And then I heard the breathing. It was a deep, wet, rattling inhalation, followed by a low, guttural exhalation that vibrated in my chest. It smelled atrocious. A sudden wave of odor flooded the tent, a sickening mixture of rotting fish, stagnant low-tide mud, and the metallic tang of old blood. I clamped my hand over my mouth and nose to keep from gagging. I slowly, agonizingly, turned my head to look at the side of the tent. The fog outside was so thick that it acted like a canvas, capturing whatever ambient moonlight managed to filter through the canopy. And against that dim gray backdrop, I saw a shadow block out the light. A massive, broad-shouldered silhouette loomed over the tent. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, judging by the angle. Then, the shadow shifted, leaning down toward the fabric. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying to whatever God was listening that it wouldn't tear through the thin nylon. When I opened my eyes, a fraction of a second later, my heart completely stopped. About 3 feet off the ground, peering directly through the mesh ventilation window of the tent, were 2 eyes. They weren't just reflecting light, they seemed to be glowing with an internal, sickly yellow luminescence. They were large, wide-set, and they were staring directly at me with an intelligence and malice that I cannot even begin to describe. They didn't blink. They just stared. Ryan let out a tiny, involuntary whimper of absolute terror. The eyes snapped toward the sound. The creature let out a low, vibrating growl that shook the very ground beneath us. It was a sound that didn't belong in the natural world. It sounded like a mixture between a silverback gorilla's warning grunt and the deep, rumbling idling of a diesel engine. I reached out blindly and grabbed Ryan's arm, squeezing it with all my might, a silent plea for him to stay absolutely still. The creature lingered for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. The glowing yellow eyes burned into my memory. Finally, it let out a sharp, exhaled huff of air, stood up to its full, terrifying height, and began to walk away. Thud, crunch, thud, crunch. The heavy, bipedal footsteps faded back into the dense, foggy woods, heading deeper up the ridge. We did not sleep for the rest of the night. We lay there, frozen, clutching our bear spray, our eyes fixed on the walls of the tent until the dim, gray light of dawn finally began to filter through the mist. As soon as we had enough light to see our own hands, we scrambled out of the tent. We didn't bother packing it up nicely. We violently shoved the wet nylon, the sleeping bags, and our gear into our packs in a blind panic. I looked at the ground where the creature had been standing. Pressed deep into the wet moss and mud were massive, bare footprints. They were vaguely human-shaped, but impossibly large, easily 16 inches long and incredibly wide, with deep impressions where thick toes had dug into the earth for traction. We didn't take pictures. We didn't try to track it. We practically threw ourselves down the steep, treacherous ravine, crashing through the salmonberry bushes until we hit the beach. The tide was out, and the fog was beginning to lift, revealing the pale morning sun. We ran almost the entire way back to the trailhead, never looking back. To this day, Ryan and I do not talk about what we saw on October 14th, 2015. I have never returned to the Olympic Peninsula, and I will never, ever camp in a coastal forest again, because I know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the fog had eyes, and it was watching us. Story 2, submitted by Nicole Taylor. My name is Nicole Taylor. The events I'm about to relate took place on November 2nd, 2019. It was a weekend that irreparably changed my relationship with nature and, frankly, my relationship with my own sanity. My boyfriend at the time, David, and I were exploring the Del Norte Coast Redwoods State Park in Northern California. It is a stunning, dramatic landscape where the ancient, towering coastal redwoods grow right up to the edge of steep cliffs that plunge hundreds of feet into the raging Pacific Ocean below. The juxtaposition of the silent, cathedral-like redwoods and the violent, roaring ocean creates an atmosphere that is both awe-inspiring and deeply unsettling. We had secured a backcountry permit to hike along the Damnation Creek Trail, an old, steep path that winds down from the highway through the old-growth forest, and eventually dead ends at a secluded, rocky beach. Our plan was to hike halfway down, find a level spot off the trail, and set up camp for the night among the giant trees. The hike in was exhausting. The trail was choked with thick ferns and the massive, sprawling root systems of the redwoods. By late afternoon, we found a perfect spot, a relatively flat bluff, heavily carpeted with soft, rust-colored redwood needles, surrounded by trees so massive that it would take 10 people holding hands to encircle one trunk. As evening approached, the coastal weather did what it always does. The temperature plummeted, and a thick, dense marine fog began to roll up the cliffs from the ocean below. It moved like a living, breathing entity, slithering up the ravines and weaving between the massive tree trunks. Within an hour, our campsite was completely enveloped. The fog was so thick, it distorted the light from our campfire, making the flames look pale and sickly, casting long, dancing, monstrous shadows against the ancient bark of the redwoods. "Creepy," David commented, poking the fire with a stick. He laughed, but it sounded forced, muffled by the heavy, damp air. "Feels like we're the only two people left on the planet." "I was just thinking that," I replied, pulling my thick wool sweater tighter around myself. The fog carried a strange odor. Normally, the redwood forest smells like pine, damp earth, and clean, fresh rain. But tonight, the mist rolling up from the ocean smelled putrid. It was an overpowering stench of rotting kelp, stagnant seawater, and something else, something harsh and metallic, like old pennies or dried blood. We finished our dinner in relative silence, the atmosphere growing increasingly oppressive. The usual sounds of the forest, the wind in the canopy, the chirping of insects, the rustling of small animals were entirely absent. It was a dead, suffocating silence, broken only by the distant, rhythmic booming of the ocean crashing against the cliffs far below. Around 9 o'clock, we decided to retreat to the tent. The cold was seeping into our bones, and the heavy fog made everything feel damp and miserable. We zipped ourselves in, read by the light of our headlamps for a bit, and eventually drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly in the dead of night. I didn't know what had awakened me, but my eyes snapped open, and I felt a cold knot of dread form in the pit of my stomach. I turned my head. David was not in his sleeping bag. Panic flared instantly. The tent flap was unzipped about halfway. I sat up, my breath misting in the freezing air of the tent. "David?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No answer. I assumed he had just gone outside to relieve himself. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The silence was absolute. The dread in my stomach twisted into a sharp, painful knot. I slowly unzipped the rest of the tent flap and peered outside. The fog was thicker than ever, a solid white wall that completely obscured the trees just a few feet away. The campfire had burned down to a few glowing red embers. "David?" I called out, a little louder this time. From somewhere deep in the fog, out toward the edge of the cliff, a voice called back. "Nicole, come here." I exhaled a massive sigh of relief. It was David's voice. Or at least it sounded like his voice. "David, what the hell are you doing out there? It's freezing. Come back to the tent." Silence. Then the voice spoke again. "Nicole, come here. I need help." I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent completely, stepping out in my boots and thermal underwear. The cold hit me like a physical blow. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" I yelled, aiming my flashlight into the swirling gray mist. The beam cut through the fog, but illuminated nothing but the massive, looming trunks of the redwoods. "Nicole, help. Come here." I took a few steps forward, the soft redwood needles silencing my footsteps. Something felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. David's voice, it was his pitch, his tone, but the cadence was entirely off. It was flat, emotionless. It sounded like a recording of David's voice being played through a broken speaker, and the spacing between the words was unnatural. "David, I can't see you. Walk towards my light," I yelled, my voice cracking with panic. From the darkness behind me, from the opposite direction of the voice, I heard the rustle of the tent fabric. I whipped around, shining my flashlight at the campsite. David was crawling out of the tent, rubbing his eyes, looking groggy and confused. "Nicole, what are you doing out there? Who are you yelling at?" My heart stopped completely. The blood drained from my face, leaving me feeling lightheaded and sick. I looked at David, then turned my flashlight back toward the dense, foggy woods where the voice had come from. "David," I choked out, backing up slowly toward him. "If you were in the tent, who was I just talking to?" David stood up, instantly wide awake, reading the sheer, unadulterated terror on my face. "What do you mean?" I was dead asleep. I didn't say anything. Before I could explain, the voice drifted out of the fog again, much closer this time. It was coming from just beyond the dying embers of the campfire. "David, Nicole, come here. I need help." David froze, his eyes going wide. He grabbed my arm and violently yanked me back toward the tent. Get in right now," he hissed, his voice shaking. We scrambled backward into the tent, frantically zipping the nylon door shut. We huddled together in the center of the small space, clutching our flashlights like weapons, our breathing ragged and shallow. "What the fuck is that, Nicole?" David whispered, his hands trembling uncontrollably. "I don't know," I sobbed silently. "It sounded exactly like you. It was trying to lure me out toward the cliff edge." Then, the heavy footsteps began. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't an animal I had ever heard. It sounded incredibly heavy, moving on two legs, slowly circling the perimeter of our campsite. The heavy, measured thud, thud, thud shook the ground beneath our sleeping mats. We heard it stop by the fire pit. We heard the sound of heavy, labored breathing. It was wet and congested, like something with fluid in its lungs. "Nicole," the voice came again, but this time it wasn't a perfect mimicry. It was distorted, deeper, guttural, as if the creature's vocal cords were tearing as it tried to form human words. "Ni dot ko le out." I clamped my hands over my ears and squeezed my eyes shut, crying uncontrollably. David held a heavy hunting knife in one hand and his flashlight in the other, aiming the beam at the thin wall of the tent. The heavy footsteps moved closer. They stopped right outside the tent, on my side. I could hear the fabric rustling slightly as something massive brushed against it. The smell hit us that same horrific stench of rotting kelp and copper that I had smelled earlier, but 100 times stronger. It was so potent it made my eyes water and my stomach heave. Then, the creature leaned down. Through the thin, orange nylon of the tent, illuminated by the ambient glow of David's flashlight, a massive shadow appeared. It blocked out everything. And near the top of the shadow, two large, glowing amber orbs appeared. They were eyes. Massive, glowing, amber eyes, reflecting our flashlight beam through the fabric. They were positioned at least 7 feet off the ground. The creature was staring down at us, its heavy, wet breathing fogging up the cold nylon of the tent. "Ni dot kole," it mocked, the voice barely more than a monstrous, rumbling growl. David let out a primal scream of rage and terror, lunging forward and slashing his knife at the side of the tent where the shadow was. He didn't cut through the fabric, but the sudden aggressive movement startled the creature. It let out an ear-splitting, high-pitched shriek that sounded like a cross between a dying rabbit and a woman screaming a sound so loud and jarring it made my ears ring. The heavy footsteps retreated rapidly, tearing through the dense underbrush, snapping thick branches like twigs as it charged blindly into the foggy darkness. We stayed huddled together in the center of that tent for the next 6 hours, waiting for the sun. Every snapping twig, every gust of wind sent us into a panic. When the gray, muted light of morning finally arrived, we didn't pack anything. We grabbed our keys and our wallets, unzipped the tent, and ran. We abandoned hundreds of dollars worth of camping gear. We ran all the way up the steep, brutal incline of the Damnation Creek Trail, never stopping to rest, never looking back. We didn't feel safe until we were locked inside our car, speeding down Highway 101 with the doors locked and the heat blasting. The authorities went down a few days later to retrieve our gear after we filed a report about a dangerous animal. They found our tent slashed to ribbons. But they said the cuts didn't look like they were made by a knife. They looked like they were made by massive, jagged claws. And surrounding the torn remains of our campsite were dozens of massive bipedal tracks, pressing deep into the redwood needles, leading straight to the edge of the sheer cliff and disappearing. Story 3, submitted by Arthur Vance. I am an experienced solo hiker. I have backpacked across the Rockies, the Appalachians, and the harsh deserts of the Southwest. But the most terrifying night of my life, the night that almost broke my mind, happened on September 28th, 2021 on the Oregon coast. My name is Arthur Vance, and I am here to tell you that there are ancient, horrific things hunting in the coastal fog, things that view us as nothing more than prey. I was visiting Ecola State Park near the town of Cannon Beach. The park is famous for its stunning, dramatic views of the ocean, the famous Tillamook Rock Lighthouse, also known as Terrible Tilly, and its dense old-growth spruce forests. The main trail I was tackling was the Tillamook Head National Recreation Trail, a rugged, muddy path that climbs steeply over the headland between Seaside and Cannon Beach. I had started my hike late in the afternoon, which was my first mistake. The weather was unusually warm for September, and I had gotten caught up exploring the tide pools at Indian Beach before hitting the main trail. By the time I reached the highest point of the headland, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant streaks of violent purple and blood red. I sat on a wooden bench overlooking the sheer drop to the ocean below, watching the waves crash against the isolated, haunted-looking Tillamook Rock Lighthouse in the distance. It was peaceful, but the peace was shattered rapidly. As the sun disappeared, the temperature plummeted, and a massive bank of coastal fog, thicker and faster than I had ever seen, rolled in off the ocean. It crested the top of the headland like a tidal wave of gray smoke, pouring through the massive Sitka spruce trees and instantly plunging the forest into a deep, oppressive gloom. I knew I had to move fast. I had about 3 miles of steep, muddy switchbacks to navigate before I reached the hiker's camp. And hiking this terrain in the dark, even with a headlamp, was dangerous. I strapped on my pack, clicked on my powerful LED headlamp, and began the descent. The forest changed instantly. The fog trapped the beam of my headlamp, creating a blinding white halo around me. Visibility was practically zero. I was navigating solely by keeping my eyes glued to the muddy path right in front of my boots. The silence of the old-growth forest, normally majestic, felt heavy and predatory. The salt-heavy air muffled the sound of the ocean, leaving only the sound of my own harsh breathing and the wet squelch of my boots in the mud. About a mile down the trail, the overwhelming feeling of paranoia hit me. It wasn't a slow build. It was an instant, visceral shock to my system. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my skin erupted in goosebumps. Every primal instinct I had honed over years of solo wilderness survival screamed at me that I was being watched, that I was being hunted. I stopped abruptly, turning my headlamp into the dense, foggy woods to my right. Nothing but massive tree trunks fading into the gray void. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded weak, immediately absorbed by the heavy mist. Silence. I shook my head, trying to rationalize the fear. "It's just the fog," I told myself. "Sensory deprivation playing tricks on your mind." I turned and kept walking, picking up my pace. A few minutes later, I heard it. Over the sound of my own footsteps, slightly out of sync, came the sound of something else, walking parallel to me in the deep woods. It was heavy, much heavier than a man. The sheer weight of the footfalls crushed thick, fallen branches with loud, echoing cracks. Snap, thud, snap, thud. My heart leaped into my throat. I stopped again. The footsteps stopped immediately. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. It was matching my pace. It was stalking me. I drew my large survival knife from its sheath on my belt, my hand shaking so violently the blade rattled against the guard. "I have a knife. I'm heavily armed. Stay back." I screamed into the fog, trying to sound authoritative, trying to sound like a threat instead of prey. From the darkness of the woods, a sound emerged that froze the blood in my veins. It was a low, chattering sound, like the clacking of massive teeth, followed by a deep, wet, wheezing exhalation. It sounded hungry. It sounded amused. I didn't wait. I broke into a run, running down a muddy, root-choked, steep coastal trail in the dark, in zero visibility fog, is a great way to break an ankle or plummet off a cliff. But the sheer terror overriding my logical brain gave me no choice. I scrambled down the switchbacks, sliding in the mud, catching myself on tree trunks, my headlamp bouncing wildly and casting terrifying, jagged shadows across the trail. Behind me, the creature abandoned its stealth. It was no longer walking parallel to me. It was pursuing me. The heavy, thundering footsteps tore through the forest, ripping through the dense underbrush with terrifying speed and raw power. It didn't care about the trail. It was smashing straight through the vegetation, moving on two legs with long, massive strides. Crash, thud, crash, thud. It was gaining on me. The putrid smell of rotting meat and stagnant salt water washed over me, a physical wave of nausea that made me gag as I ran. The creature's heavy, ragged breathing was so loud it sounded like it was right over my shoulder. I hit a straight, relatively flat section of the trail and pushed myself to sprint faster than I ever have in my life. I was hyperventilating, my lungs burning, the salt spray in the fog stinging my wide, terrified eyes. Suddenly, the trail took a sharp turn to the left, hugging a steep embankment. As I rounded the corner, I skidded to a violent halt, slipping in the mud and falling hard onto my back. Standing in the middle of the trail, completely blocking my path, was a towering silhouette. The fog was so thick I couldn't make out any features. It was just a massive, pitch black mass, standing at least 8 or 9 feet tall, its shoulders impossibly broad. But what I will never, ever forget were the eyes. Staring down at me from the towering height of the shadow were 2 glowing, pale green eyes. They didn't reflect my headlamp. They seemed to absorb the light, glowing with their own sickly, necrotic luminescence. They were narrow, angled downward, burning with a predatory hatred that paralyzed me. The creature let out a deafening, vibrating roar that shook the trees around us, taking a slow, heavy step toward me. I didn't think. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, scrambling off the main trail and blindly plunging down the steep, heavily wooded embankment to my right. It was a near vertical drop, choked with thorny blackberry bushes and deadfall. I tumbled, rolled, and violently crashed through the underbrush, ripping my clothes and tearing my skin. I lost my headlamp in the fall. I was in absolute pitch black darkness, rolling out of control down the side of the coastal mountain. I finally slammed hard into the massive trunk of a fallen cedar tree, knocking the wind completely out of my lungs. I lay there in the mud, bleeding, bruised, and gasping for air, clutching my knife with a death grip in the pitch black. Above me, on the trail I had just thrown myself off, I heard the creature stop. I heard the deep, wet breathing. I heard the clacking of teeth. I pressed my face into the wet mud, silently praying, trying to control the ragged heaving of my chest. I waited for the massive creature to plunge down the embankment after me. I waited to die. For 10 agonizing minutes, it stood up there, pacing, the heavy thud, 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 vibrating through the ground. It let out one final, frustrated, terrifying scream, a sound that echoed off the unseen cliffs and out over the roaring ocean, and then, slowly, the heavy footsteps began to retreat back up the trail. I did not move from that spot for the entire night. I lay huddled under the rotting log, freezing, bleeding, and paralyzed by fear, surrounded by the blinding fog and absolute darkness. When the sun finally rose, burning off the marine layer enough to cast a gray light through the trees, I slowly, painfully, crawled my way back up the embankment. The trail was destroyed where the creature had stood. The mud was churned up, deep furrows ripped into the earth, and massive, indistinguishable tracks were left behind. I limped the remaining miles to the trailhead, broken and traumatized. I reported my terrifying encounter to the park rangers. They listened politely, took my statement, and suggested I had been chased by a very large, aggressive Roosevelt elk that had been acting territorial. An elk doesn't walk on two legs, crushing trees in its path. An elk doesn't mimic human voices or stand 9 feet tall, blocking a trail. And an elk certainly does not have glowing, pale green eyes that stare at you with the calculated malice of a demon. I know what chased me down Tillamook Head on September 28th, 2021. It wasn't an animal, it was a monster, and it is still out there, hiding in the coastal fog, waiting for the next solo hiker to lose their way in the mist. These 3 terrifying accounts prove that when you step into the wild, you are stepping into a domain that does not belong to you. The coastal forests are ancient, deep, and heavily shrouded in mist. They provide the perfect cover for things that science refuses to acknowledge, things that stalk the tree line, watching, waiting, and hunting. If you ever find yourself wandering the edge of the world, where the dark forests meet the crushing waves, and you see that unnatural, suffocating fog rolling in, turn back. Seek shelter. Do not let yourself be trapped in the gray void, because out there, the fog has eyes. Well, travelers of the night, that concludes our journey into the coastal mists for tonight. I'm your host, Midnight Rider, and I want to thank you for joining me for another chilling episode of Scary Hours of Darkness. If these tales of what lurks within the fog sent a shiver down your spine, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment down below and let me know which of tonight's encounters terrified you the most. Would you ever camp in a coastal forest after hearing these accounts? The dark is full of secrets, and I know some of you have experienced them firsthand. If you have any stories, unexplainable events, or creepy encounters of your own, I want to read them. Send your experiences to mycreepyencounter@gmail.com, and your story might just be featured in an upcoming video. Until next time, keep a close watch on the tree line, never trust the silence, and whatever you do, stay safe out there.